Hey everybody, here we are looking at the stimulus of the week for number 2 for week 4 for the agriculture unit. We're going to look at breaking down the stimulus and seeing what kind of information we can get out of it and what kind of questions we can develop from it or could be asked about it. So for this particular stimulus, as usual, we want to look at the stimulus first, look at the title, look at the key. It's a pretty straightforward map. It's just one stimulus, a single map compared to before when we had two. The title here is International Coffee Organization, ICO, so that's probably the grouping of countries we're looking at. And we have two different shades, one for ICO exporting members and one for ICO importing members. Now, what I want to think of first is I want to start thinking of common trends between each of these categories. So it looks like my exporting members, all right, I want to look at my exporting and I can see them in these regions in South America, Mexico, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and for the most part, this tells me that I'm looking at LDCs or NICs. It's the common trend I see with these exporting members, the ones who are sending out coffee, I guess, in this case. All right. For my importing members, looking at those regions, I see very few importing members, but it looks like the United States, right? Alaska being part of the United States as well. In Western Europe, for the most part, this is a subsidiary of one of these European countries. And then one little bitty piece of Africa here in the northern piece, but mostly Western Europe, parts of Eastern Europe. And what that tells me is that most of these countries are MDCs instead, right? So I'm looking at MDCs instead of the LDCs I'd identified previously. Now, of course, I want to think about the actual regions where I find these specific countries. So I want to name regions like Brazil. Here, looking at, looks like we have Ethiopia in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Indonesia as well. Right. In terms of the regions, the specific states that are part of one side or the other. For the importing members, I have the U.S., France, maybe Norway, and we'll throw in Germany just to have it there because it's also one of these shaded ones. That all of Western Europe is shaded in this case. After identifying those trends, thinking of development, all right, it looks like I'm going to have some kind of comparison between maybe levels of development for these countries. So I want to think about what it means to be an LDC NIC, what it means to be an MDC in this, what we would call supply chain. All right, this is what we would call a supply chain. So we're looking at the supply chain of coffee in this case. And so that's going to come down to things like producers and consumers. We don't need that semicolon there. Producers and consumers, right? The ones who are producing the coffee, the ones who are consuming the coffee. Because coffee itself is a luxury product, right? So it's not going to be something that's a necessity. It's not something you need to survive. But it also means it's going to be more expensive to buy, to procure than any other commodity crop like rice or wheat or corn. It's going to be more expensive. It's a luxury crop, a luxury good, a specialty crop, all sorts of names for it. You don't need it to survive, although it is very, very good. Now, aside from that, after thinking of the supply chain, producers, consumers, what this really tells me in the context of a supply chain is that there's going to be some relationship between the ones who are producing the coffee, who are exporting it, and the ones who are consuming the coffee, who are importing it, those countries that are importing the coffee itself. And for me, at least thinking of development levels, yes, there's LDC and IC, yes, all that is still part of this trend, but as well, I'm thinking about relationships between countries, and when I think about relationships between countries in terms of their economic development, I'm thinking about Wallerstein's theory, Wallerstein's world systems theory in specific, right? Dividing the world into the periphery countries, the semi-periphery countries, and the core countries. So I want to be thinking of those relationships, and here really I'm thinking about periphery and core for the most part. So I want to think about what does the periphery do? What does the core receive? What does the core do? And what does the periphery receive? I want to think about those relationships. Right, in this case, I know that Yes, we're exporting. Yes, we're importing. But again, we can rephrase those as producers and consumers. Right? These ICO exporting countries are the producers of coffee. They're going to fit into this periphery set. And the ones who are consuming it, the importing members, those are going to be our MDCs, and they're going to be the core countries in this case. All right, so I want to be able to explain that process, what these periphery countries or semi-periphery countries are doing, producing, cultivating, growing coffee, and then what the core receives in exchange. They receive the coffee for consumption in specialty coffee shops, your Starbucks, etc. On the other hand, the core countries are procuring the coffee, they're buying that coffee from these countries, and these countries receive in exchange monetary funds. Right? That's a whole economic setup. Right? Trade and consumption going hand in hand. There's a production of a good. That good is bought for and provided to another party. That party pays for their good in the form of monetary compensation to the ones who produced the good in the first place. It's general, that world capitalist purview, right? And that's what Wallerstein's arguing against with his theory, because he's saying that these countries end up stuck in this cycle. So these exporting members and importing members, they're kind of stuck in their own ways, so to speak, as a result of histories of economic exploitation, colonization, what have you. And so these export countries become maybe dependent on the crop, right? Because coffee may be very profitable for them to sell, because they're very profitable for the MDCs to sell as well in the form of finished goods or finished products. And that can lead to other issues down the line economically, right? If you become dependent upon a single crop, you become a monoculture, and that crop fails for whatever reason, your economy is going to take a hit because you're so dependent on that one particular product. That's kind of the extreme end of things, right? If you become a monoculture. But this is what we're looking at with this particular question. We're thinking about the relationship between these different countries and how these countries interact with each other, and that's going to play into, and that plays off of rather, their development level, whether we classify them as LDCs, NICs, MDCs, and furthermore, if we can fit them into the periphery, semi-periphery, or the core in Wallerstein's theory. Because within Wallerstein's theory, it's all about that relationship globally, internationally. Periphery countries provide raw materials, labor to core countries. Core countries provide some monetary compensation, although not at the level that would be fair in a lot of cases. There's some exploitation that goes on there, exploitativeness that happens, that occurs. But in exchange, they receive those raw materials and goods, forming this cycle of development. Not that development cycles in the way that you move through different levels of economic development, but that the cycle makes sure that things stay the way they are. Right? It's very hard to get out of those development levels, according to Wallerstein, because the core countries are wanting to stay core countries, and to do that, they have to make sure that they're not participating in what quote-unquote periphery countries should be doing, which is production of raw materials, or what semi-periphery countries should be doing, which is manufacturing and processing those goods, those raw materials into finished goods. Right? Everyone's kind of separating that world economy. This is that whole globalization of agriculture, globalization of the economy that's happened, where we've done so much outsourcing that different countries have different roles in that agricultural production, especially for finished and processed products like coffee or chocolate, for example. That does it for us for our second stimulus of the week. Here's hoping this was helpful to you in creating your questions or answering your FRQs. As always, hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe. Good luck on your assignments. And always, feel free to reach out if you need any help. We'll see you next time.